This is Professor Phillips, and we will be taking a brief look at Chapter 2. Chapter 2 discusses some interesting things about similarities and differences between African Americans and Africans. So we would like to look at those parallels. Are there similarities between African Americans and Africans? This is a complex concept because obviously Africa is a continent with multiple countries and a vast array of people groups, languages, and customs. The text states that given these facts, there are some themes that can be found across the continent. Also, the textbook mentions that African psychology is the focus on, defining psychological experiences from an African perspective. A worldview is basically how we look at and perceive the world, and then how those thoughts and assumptions affect our actions. Consequently, our actions in the world then reinforce our worldview or challenge our worldview. Also, Afrocentricity is also a general awareness of the role of the African American, the connection to Africa, the diaspora, and Black people's larger role and significance in society as contributors to the world. Joseph White also did a lot of work in the field of African American psychology, which helped to reshape thinking of how African Americans should be studied. His quote says, "It is very difficult, if not impossible, to understand the lifestyles of Black people using traditional theories developed by white psychologists to explain white people. Moreover, when these traditional theories are applied to the lives of Black folks, many incorrect weaknesses dominated and inferiority oriented conclusions come about." So basically, he's saying you should study Black people with theories that were designed to study Black people, basically. Some studies have stated that African Americans have low self esteem due to socioeconomic and environmental factors. So it is important that Campbell's research states the opposite, actually. He has the African Self Consciousness Scale, and it was used to determine how African Americans feel about African or African American culture and societal issues related to racism. Campbell's also has a theory on cultural misorientation, and his theory basically recognized that there are times when self hatred occurs. For example, when someone is Black but engages in behavior that is detrimental to Black people, this would be cultural misorientation. So, African scholars caution us against making general statements regarding all Africans because um, there's they're a diverse group, but they believe that there are some broad generalities among people across the continent. So, some commonalities exist in areas like spirituality, time, orality, verb, and rhythm, according to your text, and so we want to look at those similarities. So there is an unmistakable spirituality within African cultures. There is no separation in many African nations with God or whether or not God does or does not exist. God simply exists. It's a part of each person. It's a part of daily life and function, and the pair cannot be separated. This photograph is actually a photograph, a quite common theme that happens in Ghana. When I studied abroad in Ghana, I saw that they will name their stores things like Allah My Shepherd Beauty Salon. That's what this says. And it's a normal concept that, again, God is a part of the daily life, from dusk to dawn and throughout their entire lives. Being that the experience of a collectivistic society versus an individualistic society is very different, we know that African cultures tend to be more collectivistic. So they're going to reinforce helping each other, putting the group before themselves, and this real spirit of Ubuntu. This spirit of Ubuntu is a present thread across many African nations as it permeates culture and traditions of including others, serving others before yourself, giving without expecting anything in return, maybe even housing those who are passing in your community inviting others to partake in meals, and so on. To be successful in these conditions is to have the community holistically thrive, and the individual's role cannot be separated from this concept. So when the community is a whole, the person is whole as well. There is a concept of Africa time in terms of being sensitivity to time in these cultures. There's also a concept of colored people time. The cultural understanding of times can be very different, but the fact remains that both cultures do show up later than expected, and it is accepted. However, the mentality behind why a person shows up late is very different. I remember when I was in Ghana, showing up on time to, let's say, a party or a gathering where there was going to be food, one of the cultural assumptions was that maybe this person showed up on time because they're so hungry or they didn't have food at home, so they came here on at right at the time of the gathering because they were hungry, right? And I know that in African American culture in the States here, we show up late just because we know it's an accepted practice, you know. So based on why people show up late, that is a cultural thing, but the fact that people do show up late is one of those commonalities between the two cultures. Everything does happen in its own time in a lot of African nations and cultures. It's not about being late or early, it's more about letting things happen when they happen. And time really, you focus on the future and the past together. In African cultures, it's very cyclical, and time is flexible to be extended to the event that is taking place. So even if there is an end time to the event might just continue on until people leave, right? So it really starts and ends when people come and go. Next up, we have oral traditions. This is a really interesting concept. The concept of orality and the passing on of information in oral form is an ancient tradition in many African nations. The significance of this role in a family, a tribe, or a people group was seen as an honor, and those chosen for the task were called griots in some countries. This person's role or their entire family's role might have been to pass on tradition, history, song, music, wisdom, and the generalization of responsibility to the whole community to continue that griot tradition. I know that when I was in Ghana, I would hear even the news in present day being communicated by loudspeaker on top of a taxi cab, and the taxi cab would just drive around town and someone would be just yelling the news through the loudspeaker. So there's definitely a continued tradition of oral information being passed down from one generation to the next, from daily news, from the passing of information, from the elders to the youth, and definitely that is present in that African culture. The book talks about two sets of seven concepts of Afrocentricity or Afrocentric psychology. These go into the understanding of Afrocentric psychology, so please read up on those in the text. They're on page 47. And the other set of seven principles is the principles of Nguzo Saba, which is Kwanzaa. And there's seven principles that you practice during Kwanzaa, which is generally around Christmas time. So please read up on those. That's on page 57 of your textbook. So clearly there are some similarities and some differences across African and African American cultures, but when you read the textbook, you will continue to dive deep into those. So we're going to take a closer look at Ubuntu with Dr. Nelson Mandela on the next page, and we're going to discuss the parallels that you might have seen through the reading, through the slides, through the video, and continue our lesson. If you have any questions, please email me, campus inbox me, or ask your comrades in the chat, and we can continue to learn through this chapter. All right, take care.